In this video, I'm going to be talking about a few of my favorite horror manga anthologies. I'm going to limit the list to one anthology per author because many of the best horror manga artists have multiple anthologies that I would recommend, and I don't want to fill up the entire list talking about collections from the same few authors. The collections that I'm going to talk about here today, for the most part, are a little bit lesser known and are a little bit more deep cuts into horror manga. So if you happen to not be too familiar with horror manga, I'll just recommend any of the Junji Ito short story collections. And I'll recommend any of Masaki Nakayama's works, such as Fuwa no Tane or Koisho Radio. I'm not going to go into any details on any of these collections in this video because Junji Ito's work is so well known and so often talked about. And I've already made review videos on Fuwa no Tane and Koisho Radio, so if you're interested in hearing about those, you could watch those videos. So with all of that out of the way, the first manga that I wanted to talk about is going to be Mist Story by Go Nagai. This is a one-volume horror anthology released in 1992, written by Go Nagai, who is most famous for being the creator of Devilman. This collection is a pretty interesting read because here we have Go Nagai writing a more traditional style of horror story, rather than his usual style of action, fantasy, or sci-fi with a bit of horror element to it. Despite being in a bit of a different genre than what he usually writes, the stories in this collection still do maintain his signature style and feel to them. The collection consists of 7 different stories, all of them completely unrelated to each other and featuring a wide variety of different topics and story types. There's stories about ghosts, curses, and vengeful spirits, as well as a few others that take on a more unique creative premise. There's a pretty wide variety in the types of stories that are told here, as well as a pretty wide variety in the tone of the stories, some being more serious and feeling like more true horror stories, and other ones being kind of sillier and more ridiculous and fun stories. So it's a collection with a lot of variety, so there's likely to be at least a few stories that appeal to you, no matter what kind of horror you're into. My personal favorite story was the 3 Wishes story. This one was a little bit sillier, but I liked the premise, and I thought it was a really interesting take on the stories of genies that offer wishes, but twist them in a way that works against the person making the wishes, and adding a bit of a sci-fi twist to the genie story by making the genie an alien. I also liked the Mirror of Mist and Water Hair stories as well. Overall, this is a nice collection of older horror manga stories, and is definitely a recommended read if you're a fan of Go Nagai. Next on the list, I wanted to include a collection by horror manga author Hideshi Hino, and for this video I ended up settling on choosing Lullabies from Hell, in part because I think it's one of his better collections, and because it's easy to find translations of it in English. Most of his works haven't been licensed for translation in English and also haven't gotten fan translations, so they're very hard to find translations for. So I chose one with translations, so if you watch this video you could look it up and give it a read yourself. Hideshi Hino has always been one of the most interesting horror manga artists to me. He has one of the most unique and instantly recognizable art styles of any manga artist that I've ever seen. I've always liked the way that his artwork depicts disgusting scenes of violence and gore and rotting corpses in a really bizarre, cartoony style rather than a more realistic one. His strange art style gives a certain type of atmosphere to his manga that I've never really seen replicated in any other medium. Pretty consistently throughout his works, his artwork depicts extremely disgusting scenes with over-the-top amounts of violence and gore, often with a level of absurdity to it, to the point where in some stories I'm not sure if it's supposed to be scary or funny, maybe a bit of a combination of both. In my opinion, this makes his manga always pretty enjoyable and fun to read. Hideshi Hino himself seems to be a pretty interesting person. Outside of writing manga, he's also directed movies, and one of the movies he directed was a part of a film franchise called Guinea Pig, which are notorious for being some of the most brutal and violent movies ever created. And according to legend, once in the 90s, Charlie Sheen came into possession of a copy of the film and became so convinced that it was a real snuff film that he reported it to the FBI. I don't know if that's actually a verifiably true story or more of like an urban legend, but I thought it was funny and pretty interesting either way. Anyway, back to the collection. Lullabies from Hell is a collection of 4 stories that are all pretty solid picks from Hideshi Hino's catalog of short stories. The first story, titled Lullaby from Hell, is a sort of pseudo-biographical story where Hideshi Hino tells a horror story version of aspects of his life, such as his childhood and how he became a mangaka. This is something that he does in several stories throughout his works, including one of his most famous stories, Panorama of Hell. In Lullabies from Hell, he tells the story of how he learned a lullaby from his mother, and when he sings this twisted lullaby and imagines the people that wronged him dying in horrifying ways, the deaths that he imagines for them come true. He then tells how he used this newfound power to kill countless people over his lifetime, and the story ends with a pretty nice fourth wall break, where he begins to sing the lullaby, and addresses the reader directly, telling you that you are going to now be his next victim. My favorite story in this collection is probably the last story, Zeroku's Strange Disease. The story is about a mentally disabled man named Zeroku, who contracts a strange skin disease, and instead of being allowed to get treatment, he's cast out of the village over fears of him infecting the other villagers, and he's sent outside of the village to live alone in a house by a swamp. As his disease progresses, it has horrifying effects on his body, causing his body to warp and mutate into a horrible figure. Zeroku's main hobby is painting pictures, and he uses the various strange colored liquids oozing from his body as paints to paint new artwork. The artwork in this story is some of the best in any of Hideshi Hino's manga, and the story is a good example of what Hideshi Hino does best, depicting disgusting and gruesome gore, along with some disturbing body horror. This is a really good collection of Hideshi Hino's stories, and unlike collections where the stories are pretty hit and miss, the stories in this one are all pretty solid, and this collection would make a pretty good starting introductory point for someone who isn't familiar with Hideshi Hino's works. Next I have Hyakumonogatari, or 100 Stories. This is a collection of ghost stories and other mysterious tales inspired by the ghost stories and folk tales from Japan's Edo period. This collection was written by Hinako Sugiura, who is an expert on the Edo period and dedicated her life to studying it. The stories are based on tales originating from the Edo period and are illustrated with Hinako Sugiura's beautiful artwork, which has a style that was heavily influenced by the artwork of that time period and taking a lot of inspiration from the ukiyo-e style of artwork. The format of the manga takes its inspiration from the Hyakumonogatari Kaidankai, which translates to a gathering of 100 ghost stories. This is something that's referenced pretty often in anime and manga, as well as other Japanese media. It has its origins in the Edo period, where people would gather together in a dark room lit with 100 candles. They would take turns telling ghost stories and extinguishing a candle after each story is finished. According to legend, spirits are summoned throughout the telling of these stories and would appear once the final story is told and the last candle is extinguished, leaving the room completely dark. It's said that many people would stop after 99 stories out of fear of what would happen once the 100th story is told, and this manga stops at 99 stories as well, so that may be a reference to that. The stories are all pretty short and have a feeling to them as if they were taken right out of Japanese folklore. They consist of stories about ghosts, yokai, or other mysterious, unexplainable supernatural happenings. The nature of the stories combined with the artwork that looks as if it came from that time period makes this manga a really unique read among horror manga and is a real change of pace from the typical horror manga, because here, rather than trying to scare the reader, it comes off more as if they're trying to teach the reader about the folklore from that period in Japanese history. And next up I have Kyoufu, or Fear, by Umezu Kazuo. I was definitely going to include some manga from Umezu Kazuo on this list, as he's one of the greatest horror manga artists of all time and one of my all-time favorites, and he's released a ton of great horror anthologies in his career. I ended up choosing Fear for this list because in addition to being a good collection of stories, it's easy to find the entire thing translated into English online. Other collections like The Curse of Kazuo Umezu or Kawaii Hon would be good choices also, but those may be a little bit more difficult to find in English. Kawaii Hon, which translates to the very simple title of Scary Book, has at least had its first 3 volumes translated into English and released officially, but you may not be able to find translations for any of the further volumes. Fear is a 3-volume collection of short stories that, for the most part, take place at a high school and are introduced through the point of view of a girl who writes for the school newspaper and investigates strange happenings at the school for her work. This is a nice collection that's pretty representative of Umezu Kazuo's short story works. The stories are pretty enjoyable, and there's a very wide variety of different types of stories included here. There's a ton of different stories about all kinds of ghosts, creatures, curses, and all other kinds of supernatural or unexplainable events. The wide variety of different types of stories keeps the collection entertaining to read, as well as ensuring that there'll definitely be some stories you'll like. I didn't love every single story in the collection, but if there was one I didn't like, it didn't take long to get to another story that I really did like a lot. The artwork is right there among some of the best of Umezu Kazuo's career, and this collection in particular has some of the best creature designs that I've seen in some of his works. I think this collection could be a nice entry point for someone trying to get into Umezu Kazuo's manga. And next I have From the Depths of Dark Water, or better known just by its localized title of Dark Water. This is a manga adaptation of a collection of short stories written by Koji Suzuki, who's best known as being the author that wrote The Ring. This manga adapts 4 of the 7 stories from Koji Suzuki's short story collection. Each of the stories in this collection are horror stories that are linked to water in some way. The standout in this collection is the first story titled Floating Water. This is the best story in the collection and by far the most well known. This story was adapted into a live action Japanese film and even adapted into an American film starring Jennifer Connelly in 2005. The story is about a mother and daughter who move into a new apartment complex. Strange things begin to happen around the apartment, and as the mother investigates them, she begins to draw connections to the disappearance of a young girl who lived in the apartment previously. This is a nice short collection that does a pretty good job of representing the source material, brought to life with artwork by Meimu, who also illustrated manga adaptations of popular Koji Suzuki novels such as The Grudge and The Ring. Next up I have From a Different Dimension by Chie Watari. Chie Watari is an author that has written a very large number of horror manga, and everything that I've seen from her have been short horror stories that have a more shoujo-esque or maybe josei-esque style to the artwork. So if you're a fan of shoujo manga and that type of art style, she may be a good author for you to check out. She has written a number of these short horror story compilations, and the one that I settled on for this video is From a Different Dimension, which is a 1-volume compilation that contains 3 short stories. Once again, I try to pick a collection that has translations available online so that someone who watches this video would be able to read it. And from the collections of her works that I've read, this one ranks among the better of them. In my opinion, by far the best story in this collection is the second story, Sleeping Beauty. This story is about a man who travels to a forest at the request of one of his friends, who asks him to go there to see if he can find their brother who had gone missing while doing research in that area. While searching in the forest, a storm hits, and while looking for shelter from the rain, he stumbles upon a house secluded in the woods, which he approaches to see if he can take shelter there for the night. At that house lives a beautiful young girl who claims that she has never been able to leave that house, and her aunt who seems very cold and suspicious and is very reluctant to let the main character stay the night there. While staying there, he finds out that the missing brother that he was looking for had also been at that house, so now he suspects that the aunt might have something to do with his disappearance. This is a really enjoyable, well-written story that is genuinely suspenseful and leaves the reader guessing about what's going on at that house, because nothing is really what it seems at first. I didn't think the other 2 stories were quite as good, but they were also pretty enjoyable. This is a pretty nice collection, and if you like it, the author has a ton of other collections out there, so there will be plenty more manga like it for you to read. And the last one for this video is going to be Zekkyo Gakyu, or Screaming Lessons by Amy Ishikawa. This is a collection of horror stories where the stories typically involve school-aged children, and the setting of most of the stories is also at school. There are a few exceptions to this where some of the stories will take place somewhere else, or the characters may be a bit older, but for the most part, the stories are really school-themed. Almost all of the stories are unrelated to each other, with the exception of a couple stories that give backstory on the main narrator of the series, a ghost girl named Yomi who introduces the stories at the beginning of each chapter. This manga seems to be going for a little bit younger demographic, with a very cute art style that's typical of shoujo manga. The characters and art style are some of the cutest that I've seen in any manga, and the typical cute style is a major contrast to the more horrifying scenes that take place later on in the stories. As I said, the stories are often school themed, featuring school-aged children, and the majority of the stories have a kind of lesson to them, where usually the character that's either a bully or is selfish, greedy, or ungrateful will usually have the story take a bad turn for them, and they'll usually get either their just desserts, or in some cases way more than they deserve. For example, a character that tries to take advantage of a curse or urban legend to harm one of their friends out of jealousy will usually by the end of the story end up suffering the same fate that they intended their friend to suffer. There's a pretty wide variety to the types of stories that you see here. There's a lot of stories about school urban legends, as well as ghosts, curses, and crazed killers. There's also a pretty large range in the tone of the stories. Some of the stories are more lighthearted and silly, where some are pretty horrific and gruesome, and there's even some stories that are more bittersweet and touching stories. This keeps the collection very entertaining to read, and despite being a series that at a glance seemed very different from what I would typically be looking for, and typically what I'm used to reading, ended up being one of the best horror manga that I've actually ever read, and out of the manga on this list, may have been the one that I actually enjoyed the most. And that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and comment because it does help the video and my channel out a lot. And I hope that you found some new manga here that you will enjoy reading. And thanks so much for watching.